This story from the New York Times. Republicans target social sciences to curb ideas they don't like. Florida has become a testing ground for conservative policies targeting woke ideologies in education, with new strategies focusing on eliminating or altering entire university courses rather than regulating individual professors. This approach, affecting programs in social sciences and beyond, has raised concerns among academic freedom advocates and critics who fear it will limit educational diversity and set a precedent for similar actions in other states. As colleges nationwide brace for the return of Donald Trump, who has pledged to combat perceived radicalism in education, this coordinated effort may signal a broader, more organized movement to reshape higher education.
It's interesting, too, because you always think higher education feels like it's a little less touchable than public education, younger public education. But in some ways, they're finding ways around that to make it so that they can reach in and really damage reality-based learning, right? We talk a lot about, they'll come out with statistics constantly to say, wow, these kids go off to school and they come back and they're X amount liberal, and they're almost always more liberal than when they went to school, right? They go to college and they go learn, essentially the right thinks they go to learn to be liberal. And what they're really doing is just learning about the world and saying, wow, I not only was encountering a great deal of diverse people who I hadn't encountered before, so I got a brand new worldview from many different facets while I attended school. I also learned about the world itself and about theories I had never learned about before.
Right.
And now I'm in a totally different situation, knowledge-wise and wisdom-wise, to encounter the world, and that makes me a little more liberal.
Right.
And they think it's indoctrination when really it's just exposure to new ideas.
So that's a really, really good point. One of the ways that these kids get exposed to these ideas, I've got kids in college now. So when you enroll in college, there are required courses that have nothing to do with your major. And it doesn't matter if you're getting a science. I mean, it does matter in terms of what the requirements are. But even if you're getting like a science to a STEM degree, right? There are still going to be certain courses that are just required, broad courses that are going to be required.
You need a couple humanities courses, you need a language course.
So, and those are based on the idea, the fundamental principle of a university education or a college education that we round out the education, that we build a well-rounded student, that we are not just a vocational training ground for a specific job. Like, we'll get you there. But part of the reason it takes 4 years to earn an undergrad degree typically is because there's a year or two set on building out this sort of base, this rounded base. And if what I'm wondering, Cecil, is as the world moves toward more and more specialization combined with this sort of like anti-woke radicalization and economic pressures that this article is describing, is the liberal arts education itself, the idea of a liberal arts education, fundamentally in jeopardy?
I think it is. And I think this goes along with, I think, the far right's ideology on how education should happen. And I think that there are often people will talk about, especially people on the right will talk about, why do I need to know this stuff? Why should I have to learn this stuff? I mean, I can't tell you how many times you hear people say those things aren't connected. But as you just elucidated, yeah, they're connected. Like, you becoming a whole thinking adult requires you to sort of encounter a general education, a sort of general look at the world, a survey look, right? None of these are really deep dives. When you go to Philosophy 101, you're not getting into a really, really, really deep philosophy class. You're doing a survey class of philosophy to talk about several different philosophers and learn about their ideas. Some of those ideas might be considered what we would consider conservative. Some are liberal, et cetera. And those ideas, you think about them and get a chance to talk about them, and et cetera, et cetera. And that gives you a wider range. But I think that there are people on the right who don't want, what they want is specialists. They don't want to have to waste their time. I want specialists in this thing. And so they don't care about if they're a STEM degree, they say, just teach me all the STEM classes. And that's all I ever want to do.
Yeah.
And I think I think it's a genuine mistake. I think there is something really special about I realize that I am a person with 2 degrees from a university, right? I have 4 degrees from colleges. I'm not a person who doesn't value education.
Yeah.
So I realize I am in some ways very biased about how I think that's true. But I also recognize that I went into school, I went into college years before I even started. Before I took my first philosophy class, I was a religious kid who was a Republican.
Mm-hmm.
And I went into school and suddenly I got a taste of other stuff. And it wasn't that I got indoctrinated. It was just that I got a chance to encounter other ideas and realize the ones I had were weak as fuck.
Right.
They were weak and they had nothing. They had nothing for me and they weren't true and they didn't reflect the world and it changed who I was as a person. And I think that happens. I don't think I'm a unique person. I think there's a lot of people that had the exact same experience I had and that frustrates them because that's not indoctrination. What they want is indoctrination to what they believe, period. And they don't want to hear anything about anything else. What I experienced as a university kid was I experienced a lot of different things.
Yeah.
A lot of, I was reading, far right ideologies in philosophy as well as far left ideologies in philosophy when I was getting my degree. So I learned a lot about the entire spectrum of politics and thinking. And I think, I chose to be where I am because this is sort of the reality-based approach to the world that I chose.
And it's there seems to be, because you're exactly the person that the right is afraid of, right? You converted from one of them to one of us, so to speak, right? So your experience is actually exactly the experience that they are most afraid of. And I think that this ongoing project of silo building, which is what the right is working on, it is a project of silo building, is an attempt to make sure that people don't flip. They don't switch over.
Right.
But the reality, I think, that you have to accept if you're a reasonable person, which they will never accept, is that in order to think deeply about anything, you have to know how to think broadly. You can't understand philosophy if you don't understand science, because science, there is a philosophy that undergirds science. And I would suggest that you can't understand science if you don't understand that the scientific method is at its heart also a philosophical methodology, right? So, and you can't understand, there's a lot of things you can't understand until we read stories about them, like through literature, and see how things, how the world, if you want to understand history, and all I read is a history book, and I never read, any literature about the Holocaust, I can't have actually understood the Holocaust.
There's a really, because I was studying I went to a continental philosophy school, which studies thinkers from a long time ago, essentially ancient to, till it starts becoming more modern, and the modern philosophy is all 1900s pond. So it's 20th century philosophy. And anything before then was mostly continental. There was some, what they would call modern philosophers, but they're few and far between before that point. Much of that is influenced by religion. So having religion survey courses, talking about religion and understanding what's happening in religion, and religion from a critical eye, not religion from sitting in a pew, really helped me understand certain thinkers, helped me understand how they approach the world, Kierkegaard and things like that. It was super important for me to understand their religious view, to understand their philosophical view. And those things, it's just like you said, you've got to understand, in order to understand something deeply, you have to understand it broadly.
I wonder if our project of silo building in this sort of specificity of expertise that we're working on won't create more. You remember during the pandemic, how we were how the fuck are all these medical doctors anti-vax? It seems antithetical to understanding science as a process, as a philosophical process, and as a methodology. But if you silo people into medicine not as something that relies on a body of science that relies itself on a philosophical underpinning of a methodology of knowing what true is and how do we get to true? If instead it becomes, how do we do diagnosis? Do we memorize the pharmacology? Do we understand physiology? If you strip it of its underpinning, this is how you end up with anti-vax doctors.
Sure.
I like this process of silo building won't allow deep thinking. It won't. You'll have people who have expertise but don't understand where the expertise stems from at a level that is urgent and important. It will actually stymie creativity and further thinking. This is terrible for the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.